Notorious American Grandmaster Hans Niemann is currently in Moscow, Russia, playing in AEROFLOT Open Tournament. He is currently tied for second place, and I would like to show you the game he played against international master Yaroslav Remizov. Started the game with the move e4, c5, Sicilian defense, e6, and c3. Usually in Sicilian defense, the pawn d goes to d4 immediately, but in a Lapian variation, which we have on the board, first the move c3 and then the move d4 is coming. Knight develops to f6, e5 knocking the knight off the square to d5, and d4 creating a pawn chain b2, c3, d4, e5 for black. Immediate exchange of the pawns on d4 and d6 challenging the white center on e5. Bishop develops to c4, black plays bishop e7, Hans Niemann castles short side, his opponent does the same castling short side, all developing moves, all theory, so nothing much to see here. Queen goes to e2, knight develops to c6, putting some pressure on the pawns d4 and e5, a3 for white, just preparing a retreat for the bishop to a2 if necessary, queen b6 attacking the pawns potentially on d4 and b2, and rook d1 protecting the pawn on d4. Knight a5 activating the knight, hitting the bishop on c4. Hans retreats the bishop to a2, and after knight b3 attacking the rook on a1, he has to take the knight with the bishop, and queen takes b3. Hans develops the bishop on g5, exchange of the bishops on g5, and bishop d7 connecting the rooks. Hans develops the knight. The knight jumps on d2, hitting the queen on b3. The queen takes the pawn on b2, but now white has an open file b. Hans doesn't take advantage of this right away. He first plays queen d3, threatening a checkmate on h7. The response for black is obvious. They play g6, blocking the diagonal for the queen, and knight jumps to e4 with potentially hitting the pawn on d6 or getting to an important square f6. We need to pay attention here that the black squares around the black king are very weak. Rook c8 taking the open file, queen h3 again attacking the checkmate on h7 and forcing black to play h5 and weaken their position even more. Now Hans jumps his knight to d6, hitting the rook on c8. The rook moves to c3, activating the rook and attacking the queen on h3. The queen moves away to h4, and black takes a pawn on a3 and now have an extra pawn. Rook b1, attacking the queen and potentially threatening to take the pawn on b7. The queen moves away to e2. Rook e1 attacking the queen again. Rook b3. Very interesting move. Seems like a sacrifice of the rook, but you cannot obviously take the rook because queen take e1 checkmate. Therefore, white plays h3, leaving the square h2 for the king to escape, exchange of the rooks on b1, and bishop goes to c6, x-raying the pawn on g2. Hans plays knight e4, a5 for Yaroslav, and queen g5 to infiltrate into a black position through a square h6. Black doesn't allow it, moving the king to h7. Rook goes to a1, and here it's an important point that pawn on a5 is not under attack, because if white on the next move take the pawn on a5, queen e1 check, and black would capture the rook. And I'm not sure if Yaroslav didn't see that, but he moved the queen to d3 and allowed Hans to take the pawn on a5. f6. pawn takes f6, queen takes d4. Now, in this position, if black took the pawn on d4 right away, white had a beautiful combination starting with sacrificing the rook. A rook takes d5. And then let's say if bishop takes d5, knight f6 check, king g7, knight h5 check, king h7, knight f6 back, king g7, and knight g4. And white will checkmate the black king. Therefore, in this position, black didn't take the pawn on d4, but instead played f6. They sacrificed the pawn and now took the pawn on d6. Hans Niemann brilliantly sacrifices the rook, a rook a8. What an epic move by Hans. Rook takes a8. White are playing without a rook and play a move knight f7, threatening a checkmate queen h6, queen g7 checkmate. Therefore, black has to sacrifice a piece by taking the pawn on f6. Knight takes f6. Now, after queen h6, the white don't have a checkmate on g7 because there is no pawn anymore on f6. But knight takes f6 check, king goes to g7, and Hans just retreats the knight to a square e5. And now white threatens to checkmate by taking the pawn on g6 and then checkmating on f7 or h7. King goes to f8, retreats prematurely. Knight g6 check, king f7. In this position, knight e5 check, king goes back to f8. Here, white could win this position in many ways, with pretty much any move of the knight. King h7 check, king takes h5, all winning for white. Hans decided to make a little bit unusual in this position move, king h2. I'm not sure why he had to do it, although nothing really changes. After rook a4, black would like to exchange the queens and win the game if they manage to exchange the queens. So the check on f4 is a real threat. But now Hans finishes the game with a checkmate combination, knight h7 check, king e8, queen g8 check. In this position, black resigned because after the only move they can make on the board, king e7, the next move would be queen f8 checkmate. Beautiful win by Hans Niemann. He is really having fun in Russia, winning most of his games, but the most difficult games against grandmasters like Yan Nepomniachtchi, Grishchuk, Yesipenko are still ahead.